The building came down on a Tuesday morning, and nobody ran toward it. Nobody except her. 300 bikers stood frozen on that cracked California asphalt, watching 2 tons of concrete swallow their president alive. The man they'd followed through wars, through funerals, through every dark mile this country could throw at them. And not one of them could fit through that gap in the rubble. Not one. But a 22-year-old waitress with holes in her sneakers and a brother rotting in the foster care system dropped her coffee tray, looked at that collapsing darkness, and crawled in anyway. This is the story of what she found inside. And what found her? If this story already has you holding your breath, you're exactly where you need to be. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city, what country are you watching from right now? I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go. The diner was called Rosie's, though nobody named Rosie had worked there in 11 years. Maya Rowan knew this because she'd asked once during her first week on the job, back when she still asked questions, back when she still believed the answers might matter. The owner, a heavy-set man named Earl, who smelled permanently of fryer grease and disappointment, had looked at her the way most people looked at Maya, like she was furniture that had learned to speak. Sign came with the building, he'd said, and that had been the end of that. She'd been working the 6-to-2 shift for 14 months. Same booth rotation, same laminated menus with the photograph of the Monte Cristo sandwich that hadn't been on the actual menu since the Clinton administration. Same truckers, same silence, same 22 steps from the kitchen window to the corner table where the coffee always went cold before anyone drank it. Maya moved through it all like something half present, not unhappy, exactly, just suspended, like a person waiting for a verdict that kept getting postponed. She was 22 years old. She'd been in nursing school for 11 months before the money ran out, and the program coordinator, a soft-voiced woman named Dr. Hendricks, who wore cardigans and had a framed quote about compassion on her office wall, had sat across from Maya and explained in very careful language that the school simply couldn't accommodate students who fell behind on tuition. Even students who had shown, as Dr. Hendricks put it with a kind of pain delicacy, genuine clinical promise. Maya had nodded. She had not cried. She had walked out of that office, sat in her car in the parking structure for 23 minutes, and then driven to Earl's to pick up a double shift. That had been 14 months ago. The thing that kept her moving, the actual engine underneath all of it, the thing she thought about during the slow hours between the breakfast rush and the lunch crowd, was Danny, her brother. 11 years old, currently in his 3rd foster placement in 2 years. Currently 40 minutes south in a group home that smelled like industrial cleaner and broken radiators. Maya had a photograph of him taped to the inside of her locker. He was grinning in it, missing his left front tooth, holding up a drawing he'd made of the 2 of them standing in front of a house with a red door. Her brother drew the same house over and over. She didn't know if he remembered that they'd never lived in a house like that, or if he was drawing something he was still waiting for. She was trying to get him back. The caseworker, a man named Briggs who returned her calls maybe 1 time in 3, had explained the requirements with the patience of someone explaining them for the 100th time to someone who wouldn't understand. Stable housing, documented income, completed home study, legal petition, court date. A checklist that assumed Maya was standing still while she completed it, when in reality every item on the list required money she didn't yet have, and time she was already spending. She was getting there. That's what she told herself on the bad mornings. She was getting there. The morning the bikers came was not supposed to be special. Maya was on her 3rd refill loop of the breakfast rush when she heard them. Felt them, really, before she heard them. A low rolling vibration in the floor beneath her feet, like distant thunder deciding to get closer. The coffee cups rattled faintly in their saucers. Earl looked up from the register with an expression of vague alarm, and then the sound resolved itself into something specific and unmistakable. Engines. Dozens of them. Then more than dozens. She went to the window. The highway outside Rosie's diner ran through a stretch of flat California valley where the mountains sat like suggestions on the horizon, and the morning light came in sideways, pale gold and indifferent. On a normal Tuesday, the traffic was mostly 18-wheelers and the occasional county vehicle. But what was rolling down that highway now was something else entirely. They came in a column that seemed to have no end. Harley-Davidsons, mostly, iron and chrome and aged leather, Hundreds of them, moving in a formation that was loose enough to breathe but tight enough to mean something. Patches on the backs of jackets caught the light. American flags, unit insignia, names of the dead stitched in thread that had faded from washing and weather and years. Veterans Charity Run. Maya had seen the flyers posted around town for the past 2 weeks, but seeing the flyers and seeing this were completely different things. The lead bike pulled off first, and the column followed with a kind of muscular inevitability, like a river finding its turn. Earl said, from somewhere behind her, "Lord have mercy," and then immediately began calculating tables. Maya was already pulling on her apron. They filled the diner and the parking lot both. The ones who couldn't get seats leaned against their bikes and drank coffee from paper cups that Maya and the 2 other waitresses ferried out in cardboard carriers, and nobody complained about the wait, and nobody snapped at anyone, which was already different from the usual Tuesday crowd. She noticed things, the way she always noticed things. Occupational habit, or maybe just the particular attention of someone who had learned early that the details of a room were worth tracking. The way some of them moved like men who still expected the ground to be uneven. The way several of them had the particular stillness of people who had learned, somewhere and at some cost, to be very quiet. The patches. The faces. The careful, practiced way some of them looked at the door when they sat down, always angled so the entrance was visible. She was refilling the coffee at the long counter when the man at the end of it spoke to her. "You look like someone who's been here since before the sun came up." Maya glanced up. The man was somewhere in his mid-60s, though it was the kind of age that was hard to place precisely because it had been earned rather than simply accumulated. Big through the shoulders, the kind of big that wasn't gym-built but work-built, and then worn down by time into something that had more to do with density than size. A face that had seen weather. Real weather, not metaphorical. A scar ran from his left jaw toward his ear, old and silver. His eyes were the particular gray-blue of winter sky, and they were watching her with an attention that was not uncomfortable exactly, but was absolutely direct. His patch read, "President." Beneath that, 2 words that meant nothing to her yet, "Iron Angels." Below his cut, his vest, she saw what looked like a Vietnam service ribbon, worn smooth. 5:30, she said. "You want more coffee?" "Please." He watched her pour. Long shift. Same shift it always is, he considered that. "You from around here?" "More or less. She set the carafe down. "You?" "Less," he said. A brief, weathered, almost smile. "These days." His name, she'd learn later, was Gideon Mercer. But the men who rode with him, all 347 of them, stretched across 15 chapters from Sacramento to San Diego, called him Iron. She didn't ask why. Some things you learn not to ask. What she did ask, because something in the way he was sitting, the particular stillness of him, made her think of the veterans ward she'd done her clinical rotation through back when she was still a nursing student, was, "Were you over there a long time?" He looked at her, not startled. More like recalibrating, like he was used to people not asking. "2 tours, he said. "Long enough." "I did a clinical rotation. VA Hospital, East Wing." She was already moving because Earl was giving her the look that meant there were other tables needing attention. The men there, they had the same way of sitting. She was 3 steps away when he said quietly, "What way is that?" She looked back at him. "Like they're still listening for something," she said, "even when everything's quiet." He didn't answer, but he watched her go, and the expression on his face was something she couldn't name and didn't have time to examine, because there were 9 other tables, and the kitchen window was stacking up, and the morning was still moving. It was 40 minutes later when the ground moved. The first tremor was subtle, a kind of shimmer in the air, a faint rattle of glassware. Maya had felt small tremors before. Living in California meant making a certain peace with the Earth's instability. She steadied a water glass, looked toward the kitchen, saw Earl's head come up. Then the second one hit. This one was not subtle. It came up through the floor like something enormous turning over in its sleep, a rolling lurch that sent every standing person grabbing for the nearest solid thing, and Maya's hand found the counter, and the counter jerked sideways, and every glass on the shelf behind the register came down at once, in a single crystalline crash. Outside, she heard the engines, the bikes still running in the lot, rev and stutter as the asphalt moved beneath their kickstands. She heard shouting. She heard something very large, somewhere close, making the sound that large things make when the forces holding them together stop working. That sound. A low grinding roar, like the earth eating itself. She was at the window before she knew she was moving. The Veterans Hall sat 200 yards north of the diner where the highway curved. It had been empty for years. A mid-century municipal building, all cinder block and old wood framing, the kind of structure that had been built to last 30 years and had made it to 55 on inertia and deferred maintenance alone. There had been talk of the charity ride stopping there for the ceremony. Maya had heard someone mention it that morning. What she was looking at now was the building in the process of no longer existing. The roof came in first, a slow, catastrophic compression that she watched happen in what felt like separate frames, the walls bowing outward, and then the whole structure folding inward like a paper model crushed by a careless hand. Dust punched upward in a gray-brown column. The sound reached her a half-second after the sight, a concussive thud that she felt in her back teeth. The bikes in the lot were already moving, riders scrambling off, running toward the collapsed building, shouting to each other. She could hear, even through the diner's windows, the desperate organized chaos of men who knew how to respond to catastrophe assembling into something purposeful. Maya was already untying her apron. She pushed through the diner door into the cold morning air. The dust cloud was drifting south across the highway, and through it she could see the pile of rubble where the Veterans Hall had been. Concrete slabs tilted at terrible angles, splintered wood, shattered glass catching the pale sunlight. 300 bikers surrounded it, some pulling at debris with their bare hands, some working in pairs, some shouting into gaps in the wreckage. She pushed past the first group. A man grabbed her arm, young, wild-eyed, blood on his forearm from a cut she could tell wasn't serious. "Stay back," he said. "Building's not stable. Let go of my arm." She said it flat and steady, the way Dr. Hendricks had taught them to speak in clinical settings, the voice that came from the belly and expected compliance. The man let go. She moved through the crowd until she found the cluster of men gathered around what seemed to be the focus of the operation, a section of the collapse where a massive slab of concrete had come down at an angle, creating a kind of lean-to of rubble, a narrow, dark gap at its base. The man with the winter sky eyes, Gideon Mercer, Iron, the president of the Iron Angels, was under there. She knew this because a man built like a wall, with a sergeant-at-arms patch, and a face that was barely holding together, was on his knees at the gap's edge, yelling into the darkness with the particular desperate control of someone who has trained himself not to panic and is being tested past the edge of his training. "Iron, Iron, talk to me, Gideon." From inside the darkness, faint, strained, a voice, alive. Compressed by pain, but alive. Maya crouched down beside the sergeant-at-arms. The gap was perhaps 16 inches wide at its widest. She looked at the man beside her, who was built across the shoulders like a truck chassis. She looked at the gap. She looked at herself. "How long since the quake?" she said. The man looked at her. His name, she'd learn later, was Marcus. He'd done 3 tours, 2 in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan, and he had never in his adult life felt as helpless as he felt in this moment. 4 minutes, he said. Maybe 5. She could smell the gas from where she was kneeling, a thin, sweet chemical smell threading through the dust, a ruptured line somewhere beneath the rubble. "Is there anyone in that building who isn't him?" she said. "No, he went in for the ceremony prep. Alone." She pulled off her outer sweater, left herself in her thin uniform shirt, and looked at the gap one more time. "I need a flashlight," she said. "And I need everyone to stop pulling at this debris until I'm out, because if you shift that slab—" "You're not going in there," Marcus said. She turned and looked at him directly. He had 100 pounds on her, and he was shaking with controlled adrenaline, and he meant what he said. She said very quietly, "Do you fit through that gap?" He looked at it. "No," he said. "Then you need a flashlight," she said. "And you need to stop pulling at the debris. And you need to tell me where his voice was coming from." The silence around them had the texture of held breath. Hundreds of men watching a woman they'd never seen before this morning make a decision they didn't have the right to unmake. Someone pressed a flashlight into her hand. Maya Rowan went down flat on her stomach in the California dirt, put the beam of light into the darkness, and crawled in. She was 6 feet into the gap when she heard it. Not Iron's voice this time, but something else. A deep, resonant groan from somewhere above and to her left. The sound of stressed concrete finding a new position. The ground shook once, faintly, an aftershock. And behind her she heard Marcus's voice from the entrance. Maya. She didn't know he knew her name. The gas line pressure just dropped. That means it's building somewhere. You have maybe 8 minutes before that pocket finds a spark. 8 minutes. In the dark. In a collapsing building. With a man she'd spoken to for 4 minutes over a coffee refill, a man she knew almost nothing about, except that he had winter sky eyes and a voice that sounded like it had been forged in the same fire that had burned the scar into his jaw. She moved the flashlight forward, and in the beam, 20 feet ahead of her in the narrow dark, she saw a hand. It was reaching out from beneath the edge of a concrete beam, palm up, fingers slightly curled. Still. Waiting. And she understood suddenly, with the particular clarity that comes in moments stripped of everything except what's essential. She understood that everything she'd been moving toward in the past 14 months, all the slow accumulating motion of her half-suspended life, had been pointed at this exact moment. The hand in the dark, the 8 minutes on the clock, the woman on her stomach in the rubble who was, against all reasonable expectation, the only person who could fit through the gap. She pressed forward into the darkness, and somewhere above her the concrete groaned again. And somewhere behind her she could hear, very faintly, the sound of hundreds of men standing perfectly still. Waiting. The hand did not move. That was the first thing Maya registered as she pushed herself forward through the gap. Not the smell, which was already thick and wrong. A chemical sweetness layered over the older smells of wet concrete and disturbed earth, and something metallic she recognized from the VA ward and did not let herself name. Not the sound, which was everywhere and nowhere, the deep structural groan of a building that had stopped being a building and was now simply mass looking for the lowest point. The hand did not move, and that meant she was working against a clock that had already been running longer than she knew. She kept the flashlight low. Someone, Marcus or one of the others, had told her before she crawled in that the gas smell was coming from the northwest corner, which put it somewhere to her left and forward. She kept that coordinate in her head the way Dr. Hendricks had taught her to hold patient vitals during a crisis. Not by thinking about them, but by making them part of the background, the constant hum beneath every other decision. The gap narrowed as she moved. At some point, she stopped being able to get her elbows fully out to her sides, and she switched to pulling herself forward with her fingertips, dragging her hips through the gravel. Her knees were already bleeding through her uniform pants, though she felt it only distantly, the way you feel cold water while you're swimming and then feel it sharply when you stop. "Hey," she said. Not loud. The rubble overhead made her instinctively quiet, the way you stay quiet in a room where something fragile is balanced. "I'm coming toward you. Keep talking." The voice came from directly ahead. Strained but controlled. A man who'd spent decades learning to manage what his body did under pressure, and who was now burning through the last of those reserves. "Left," the voice said. "Come left. There's a drop." She shifted left, found the edge with her hand. A concrete lip. Below it a hollow space roughly the size of a bathtub, where a slab had come down at an angle against a fallen support beam and created a pocket just large enough to hold a man and call it survival. She rolled over the lip and dropped down into it. Gideon Mercer was on his back. The beam had caught him across the lower left leg, a concrete reinforced timber, 6 inches square, lying across his shin at an angle that told her the bone beneath it was not intact. His face was gray with concrete dust, and the particular pallor that came from pain sustained long enough to stop being acute and start being systemic. His eyes, when the flashlight found them, were open and clear and fixed on her with an expression she would remember for a long time. Not relief, exactly. More like the look of a man who had stopped expecting rescue and was recalibrating. "You're the waitress," he said. "You're the president," she said. She was already moving her hands over him, collarbone, sternum, ribs, checking the breathing. Clear. She pressed 2 fingers to his wrist. His pulse was slow and deliberate, which in another context would have been a good sign, and in this context meant his body was doing what trained bodies did when they conserved. He'd been doing this for a while. "How long were you conscious?" she said. "Whole time." "Pain scale?" 7. A beat. 8. He was at an 8, and he'd said 7. She filed that. Anyone else in here? No, I checked. His jaw tightened as she moved her hands toward the beam. I yelled. Nobody answered. Okay. She put her hands on the timber. It was not going to move with her hands. She sat back on her heels and looked at the space around them, moving the flashlight slowly. The pocket they were in was roughly triangular. The angled slab above, the collapsed floor below, the beam across his leg forming a kind of threshold she was going to have to work around. To her left, the chemical smell was stronger. She had perhaps 6 minutes now, maybe 7. You have a nursing background, he said. It wasn't a question. I had one. What does that mean? It means I know enough to get you out of here and not enough to do it without hurting you. She found what she was looking for. A length of steel rebar, twisted but intact, wedged between 2 slabs at an angle that suggested it might function as a lever if she could find the right fulcrum. I'm going to need you to not pass out. I don't pass out, he said. Everyone passes out, she said. If you feel it coming, tell me. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, far outside, muffled by 60 tons of rubble, she could hear voices. Marcus's she thought she could identify, though she couldn't make out words. The sound was reassuring in the way that radio contact is reassuring. Not because it changes anything, but because silence would be worse. Why did you come in, he said. She was working the rebar free, testing its flex. Because nobody else fit. That's not a reason, he said. That's a fact. She stopped, looked at him. His eyes were steady on her, despite everything, despite the gray pallor and the leg and the gas smell thickening around them, despite the thin line of blood she could now see tracking from his hairline down through the dust on his left temple. You have a head wound, she said. I know. How long ago did it stop bleeding? Maybe 10 minutes before you got here. She recalculated. The beam had struck him in the initial collapse. Call it 15, 16 minutes of sustained blood loss before the wound clotted. She needed to check his pupils, but the flashlight in this space would make it difficult to assess accurately. She moved it across his face anyway, watched the pupils contract, equal and reactive. She let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. You didn't answer my question, he said. I know. She went back to the rebar. Does it matter right now? He considered. No, he said. I suppose it doesn't. The rebar came free with a sound like a cork pulled from a bottle, a dull percussive pop that made the slab above them shift. Just a tremor, barely perceptible, but they both felt it, and both went completely still in the same instant, the same instinct. And in that stillness, Maya became aware that she and this man had been strangers 40 minutes ago, and now they were sharing the particular intimacy of people who are inside the same potential death. Tell me something, she said very quietly, not moving, while we wait for it to settle. Tell you what? Anything. I need you conscious. The slab steadied. Neither of them moved yet. My daughter's name was Claire, he said, and something in the way he said it, past tense, carrying the specific weight of past tense, told her everything she needed to know about what that sentence cost him. How old? She said. Her hands found the rebar again, moving slowly. She'd have been 31, this March. A pause. Drunk driver, 8 years ago. She was picking up her kid from soccer practice. Maya positioned the rebar against the concrete block she'd identified as the fulcrum point. What was her kid's name? Silence. Then, Lena. She's 9 now. Lives with her father in Phoenix. Another pause. We don't see each other enough. I don't know how to... He stopped. Exhaled through his nose, long, controlled breath. I don't know how to be her grandfather. I don't know what that looks like without Claire in the middle of it. Maya pressed down on the rebar. The beam shifted, a quarter inch, maybe less, but she felt the pressure across the fulcrum change, and she pressed harder, driving her weight down through her palms, and the beam moved another quarter inch, and Gideon made a sound that he immediately swallowed, a compressed, involuntary sound that told her the bone was definitely broken in at least one place. Almost, she said. Keep going. Your turn, he said through his teeth. What? You told me to keep talking. You talk. She pressed harder. The beam lifted, half an inch, 3/4, and she locked her elbows and said, in the flat, focused voice of someone spending all their remaining oxygen on a single task. My brother is 11. He's been in foster care for 2 years. I'm trying to get him back. I need stable housing and documented income, and I have neither of those things, but I'm going to have them. His name is Danny, and he draws the same house over and over again, a house with a red door, and I don't know if he knows we've never had a house like that, or if he's just drawing what he's waiting for. The beam was at an inch now. Gideon moved his leg. She saw it in his face, the effort, the cost. Sliding it toward him across the concrete floor, and the sound he made was longer this time and lower, and she recognized it as the sound of someone who is operating past the last known edge of their pain tolerance. "Danny," he repeated, and the word came out compressed and rough. "Good name." "Move," she said. "Now, toward me. Passat." I was not a small man. This became relevant the moment she had to get him moving through the same 30 feet of collapsed corridor she'd come through. 30 feet that had been difficult enough to navigate alone on her stomach, and were now going to be navigated with a man who had 6 feet of height and a broken leg and was running on the last dregs of controlled adrenaline. She went first, flashlight in her left hand, her right hand pulling his, a grip she locked at the wrist because she didn't trust either of them to maintain finger strength through what was coming. He moved behind her on his elbows and his good knee, dragging the broken leg, and every time it caught on a piece of debris she heard it in the sound he made, and she kept moving because stopping would be worse. The gas smell was everywhere now, not stronger in one direction, just everywhere, saturated, the air itself gone thick with it. She was breathing through her mouth, shallow breaths, though she knew that didn't actually reduce the exposure, knew it was just psychology, the body trying to do something when doing nothing felt like dying. "How far?" he said. 20 feet? She moved the flashlight forward. The gap ahead of them looked smaller than she remembered it, and she understood with a drop in her stomach that the structure had shifted since she came in, that the rubble was settling, that the window she'd crawled through was closing. She did not say this. 15, she said instead. Keep moving. He was. Whatever Gideon Mercer had been before the war, whatever the war had made him, whatever the years since had layered on top of that, the man had a will that operated somewhere below the level of pain. She could feel it in the grip he had on her wrist. Not desperate, deliberate. The grip of someone who has decided a thing and is doing it. She reached the gap first. Pushed the flashlight through, looked out, and saw Marcus's face, 4 feet away, on his stomach, in the California dirt, eyes locked on the opening, and when he saw her, his face did something that she would have found moving if she'd had time for it. "She's out," he said loudly over his shoulder. "She's at the gap." Then to her, "Gas pressure?" "Strong," she said. "We have maybe 2 minutes. There's something in here that's going to spark." She didn't know what, but in the last 30 feet of crawling she had smelled something else beneath the gas, an ozone smell, the smell of an electrical short, old wiring in the collapsed walls. The earthquake had broken things that were already old, already failing, and now those failures were compiling towards something. "He's right behind me," she said. "He has a broken leg. You're going to have to pull him through from your side." "We've got him," Marcus said. "Go!" She went through the gap, and Marcus caught her arm, and she was out in the morning air, and it hit her. The cold, the space, the light, like a physical thing, like something she'd forgotten the texture of. She turned immediately, went back to her knees at the gap's edge, and a second later she could see Gideon's hands coming through. And then Marcus and 2 other men had him, pulling, and she heard the sound he made as the broken leg came through the gap, and it was the worst sound she'd heard in the entire experience. He was through. He was on the ground. He was breathing. She put 2 fingers to his wrist. His pulse was still there, faster now, the body's belated panic response. But there. And then the ground moved again. Not a tremor. Something structural. A final catastrophic resettlement of the collapse, like the building exhaling its last breath. The concrete nearest to the gap heaved upward by 4 inches, and then came back down, and the gap disappeared. And from somewhere inside the rubble there was a dull whump that she felt in her chest before she heard it, and then the east side of the debris pile began to smoke. The gas had found its spark. Marcus was already moving, pulling Gideon, 2 other men on his other side, and someone had Maya's arm, and she was running. They were all running, and the world behind them was making a sound like a held note rising to pitch. She was 20 feet from the rubble pile. When the fire broke through the debris in a column of orange heat that she felt on the back of her neck, like a door opened onto a furnace. The crowd of bikers ahead of them parted, and then they were through it, and she stopped running because her legs had made the decision independently, and she put her hands on her knees and breathed, just breathed, the cold California air going into her lungs in ragged installments. Behind her, the Veterans Hall finished dying. Thus, she didn't lose consciousness. That was her first clear thought when the world settled enough to think in sentences. She had not lost consciousness, which meant she had not hit her head and did not have a concussion, which meant the blurred quality of the next several minutes was something else, some ordinary human overwhelm she didn't have a clinical name for. She was sitting on the asphalt. She didn't remember sitting down, but the asphalt was under her and her back was against something, someone's bike, she realized, parked at the edge of the lot. Her hands were in her lap. They were shaking. She looked at them like they belonged to someone else. The world around her was motion and sound, sirens in the distance, getting closer, bikers moving in organized patterns. She could see, even through the blurredness, that they were coordinated, that someone was directing traffic and someone else was setting up a perimeter, and two men were doing field first aid on Gideon where they'd laid him on the ground 20 feet away. They had a kit. They knew what they were doing. She noted all of this with the distant, analytical part of her that never fully switched off, and then the rest of her brain caught up to her body, and she started, very quietly, to shake harder. A jacket landed on her shoulders. Heavy, worn leather, warm from someone's body. She looked up. Marcus was standing above her. His face was a controlled wreck. Whatever he was feeling was visible in the set of his jaw and the red rims of his eyes. But his voice, when he spoke, was level. "You did good," he said. She nodded. Couldn't speak yet. He sat down next to her on the asphalt, not touching her, just present in the way that large, careful men sometimes are, as a kind of shelter. They both looked at Gideon across the lot. Someone had his leg immobilized with what looked like strips from a cut-up jacket and 2 tent stakes. I was talking. She could tell he was talking because she could see him looking up at the men around him and his mouth was moving, and even from here she could read the energy of it. He was giving instructions. The man had a broken leg and an untreated head wound and had just survived a building collapse, and he was giving instructions. "How long has he been president?" she said. Her voice came out hoarser than she expected. 12 years. Marcus looked sideways at her. Before that, he was VP for 7. Before that, he patched in straight from the VA in 78. A pause. He built this chapter from 6 members in a barn outside Fresno. She absorbed this. The paramedics were arriving now. She could see them pushing through the edge of the crowd, and the bikers were parting to let them through with a precision that suggested this, too, had been arranged. Nobody was preventing the paramedics. Nobody was obstructing. They were creating a path. "He's going to be okay?" she said. "I don't know," Marcus said, "but he's still running the operation from the ground, so—" He let that finish itself. She almost smiled. It died before it fully formed, because her body didn't have the resources for it, but it was close. The paramedics reached Gideon. She watched them work, watched with the particular eye of someone who had been trained to see what they were doing and could assess it. They were good. They had him packaged for transport in under 4 minutes, which was fast for a field situation with an unstable patient. As they moved him toward the ambulance, Gideon turned his head. I was looking for something, scanning the lot, and she understood a moment before it happened that he was looking for her. His eyes found her across the distance, and he held the look for 3 seconds, just 3, while the paramedics moved around him and the crowd shifted. And in those 3 seconds, she got the impression of a man trying to pass something through his eyes that he didn't have the words for yet. Then they loaded him, and the ambulance doors closed, and he was gone. Marcus stood. He picked up his helmet from the ground beside him. He looked down at her. "They're going to want to talk to you," he said. "Police? Probably the fire investigator. Maybe some others." He paused. "You want someone to sit with you while you wait?" She thought about it. She thought about Earl, who was probably inside the diner right now, calculating whether the police tape was going to hurt his lunch trade. She thought about the caseworker Briggs, who wouldn't return this call either. She thought about Dr. Hendricks and her framed quote about compassion, and her very careful language about accommodation. "I'm okay," she said. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. He had the eyes of a man who had been lied to often enough to know the specific weight of a person saying they were fine when they were not, and she could see him register it and make a choice about how to respond to it. "Your name's Maya," he said. "Yeah. I'm Marcus." He held out his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and brief and had none of the performance of a handshake. It was just contact, acknowledgement. "We're going to be at St. Catherine's. That's where they're taking him." She nodded. He turned and walked toward his bike. She watched him go. Around her, the parking lot was transforming, the controlled chaos of the immediate aftermath giving way to the harder, longer work of aftermath management. Police were arriving in force now, establishing perimeters, taking statements. The fire crew was on the debris pile. The bikers were moving in ones and twos toward their bikes, but not leaving, congregating at the edges of the lot, engines off, waiting. She realized, sitting there on the asphalt in a leather jacket that smelled like motor oil in someone else's history, that she did not know what to do next. This was not a familiar feeling. Maya Rowan had been operating on a specific forward momentum for 14 months. Next shift, next paycheck, next call to Briggs, next box checked on the list. The list had kept her from having to feel the shape of the life around the list, the hollow parts. But right now the list was very far away, and what was here was this. A parking lot covered in broken glass and concrete dust, 300 bikers who kept glancing at her with expressions she couldn't fully read, and the residual trembling in her hands that told her she was not as okay as she'd said. She was still sitting there when the woman came. She appeared from the direction of the highway, walking with the deliberate pace of someone who is controlling their speed because the alternative is running. 60, perhaps, or perhaps younger, with the face of someone whose life had put decades into the wrong places. Steel gray hair pulled back, a patch on her jacket that read Iron Angels, Ruby Coast, and below it, President's Wife. She stopped in front of Maya, looked down at her with an expression that was too complicated to be any single thing, grief and relief and anger, and something that might have been a very controlled form of awe. "You're the girl," she said. "Maya," Maya said. "I'm Ruth." She sat down. Not next to Maya, across from her, cross-legged on the asphalt, which was not a thing Maya had expected a 60-year-old woman in a leather jacket to do. Up close, her eyes were dark and very sharp. "Are you hurt?" "No." "You're shaking." "I know." Ruth looked at her hands, then at her face, then somewhere through her, the way people look when they're not seeing you but something you're reminding them of. "He talked about Claire," Maya said. She didn't know why she said it. The words came from the same place the shaking came from. Ruth went very still. "He told you." There wasn't a lot else to do." A long pause. The sirens had settled into a background frequency. Somewhere across the lot, a Harley engine turned over and then shut off again, like someone starting a sentence and deciding against it. "He doesn't talk about her," Ruth said. "Not to anyone. Not even to me. Most of the time." She looked at her hands in her lap. "She's been gone 8 years, and there are still rooms in that man that I can't find my way into." Maya didn't say anything. She understood about rooms. "He's going to be all right," Ruth said, and it was not a question, and it was not a platitude. It was a declaration, the kind that comes from decades of willing things into being. He's too stubborn to be anything else. "His leg. He's had worse." Ruth's mouth pressed thin. "He's had worse in places where there was no one like you at the end of it." She looked at Maya directly. "How old are you?" 22. Something moved across Ruth's face. 22, she repeated, and then very quietly, "What were you thinking?" Maya looked at the debris pile. The fire crew was moving through it methodically now, the fire itself suppressed, the smoke thinning to a white thread against the gray sky. "I was thinking that nobody else fit through the gap," she said, "and that he was in there." "That's all?" She thought about Danny, about the house with the red door, about the specific arithmetic of being the only person available to do the thing that needed doing, and the way that arithmetic had been the operating logic of her life for 2 years, maybe longer. "That's all," she said. Ruth studied her for a long moment. Then she reached out and straightened the collar of the leather jacket that was still on Maya's shoulders, a brisk, careful gesture, maternal without being soft, and stood up. "You're going to come to the hospital," she said. It was not an invitation. I don't... You're going to come to the hospital, and when Gideon wakes up from whatever they give him, you're going to be there, because I know my husband, and I know that if you're not there, he is going to find a way to make the hospital staff locate you, and that's going to be an inconvenience for everyone. She looked at her with those dark, sharp eyes. You have somewhere else to be? Maya thought of Earl, of the double shift she was now 4 hours into missing, of the way the morning had started with 22 steps from the kitchen window to the corner table and had arrived here. No, she said. Good, Ruth said. Marcus will take you. She walked away. Maya watched her go. Watched the way the bikers moved around her, not parting so much as naturally adjusting their orbits. The way a room adjusts around someone who has been its center long enough to make that gravitational. Maya got to her feet. She was steadier than she expected to be. She pulled the leather jacket tighter around herself. It was enormous on her, the shoulders hanging past hers, the hem at her thighs. And she looked at the debris pile one more time, at the smoke still threading upward from the place where the building used to be, at the ordinary gray California sky above it that had no idea what had just happened beneath it. Then she went to find Marcus. She didn't call Earl. She knew she should. She knew that on some pragmatic, future-facing level, the job at Rosie's was one of the documented income items on Briggs's checklist, and that missing a shift without calling was the kind of thing that could give Earl an excuse to let her go, and that losing the job would set back the timeline for getting Danny by months. She knew all of this, and she didn't call. She got on the back of Marcus's bike, and she held on, and they followed the ambulance south toward St. Catharines, and the wind came off the valley cold and flat, and she leaned into it, and for the first time in 14 months, she was not thinking about the checklist. She was thinking about a hand reaching out of the darkness, palm up, fingers curled, waiting. She was thinking about what it meant that she had reached back. They were 4 miles from the hospital when Marcus said something over the wind, and she leaned forward to hear him. There's something you should know, he said. The way he said it, the particular weight of it, the way his shoulders had changed, made her go very still on the back of the bike. What? She said. He was quiet for another half mile. The hospital was visible now, the top floors of it, above the tree line. Iron didn't just go into that building by himself, he said. He went in because someone told him it was clear, that the ceremony coordinator had already done a walkthrough. He paused. We can't find that person. The coordinator. Nobody has seen him since before the quake. She processed this. You're saying, I'm saying the building was condemned, Marcus said. Has been for 3 years. And I'm saying the inspection report that cleared it for the event was filed 6 days ago by someone who has now disappeared. His voice was flat and measured, the voice of a man delivering a briefing. And I'm saying that before I could get to Iron when the building went down, I saw a man I didn't recognize walking away from the north side of the structure. The hospital entrance was coming up. Marcus slowed the bike. I'm telling you this, he said, because you were in there with him, and because whatever is happening, it started before that earthquake. He pulled to a stop at the entrance. She got off the bike. Her legs were steady, but her mind was moving very fast, assembling pieces, and what they were assembling into was a shape she had not been expecting when she'd walked out of Rosie's diner that morning with a coffee carafe in her hand. She looked at Marcus. He looked back at her, and his expression was the expression of a man who has handed someone information that cannot be unhanded. You think someone tried to kill him? She said. Marcus said nothing, which was its own answer. And somewhere above them, in a room she hadn't reached yet, the man she had pulled out of the dark was being put back together by people who didn't know yet what she and Marcus knew. That the collapse might not have been the earthquake alone, that the condemned building might not have been the only trap, and that whoever had cleared that building and then disappeared into the California morning might already know that Iron Mercer had survived, and might already be deciding what to do about it. The hospital smelled like every hospital Maya had ever been in. Antiseptic and recycled air, and the particular flatness of a building that had been designed to process suffering efficiently. She had always found it comforting, that smell. It meant systems. It meant someone had thought through what needed to happen and built an infrastructure around it. Tonight, it just made her tired. She'd been in the waiting room for 2 hours and 40 minutes when Marcus came and found her. Not to tell her Gideon was out of surgery. That information had come from Ruth, delivered in person with the brisk economy of a woman who had been through this before and had made a private peace with each iteration of it. Stable. They'd set the leg. He'd need 3 months minimum before weight bearing. The head wound was superficial. He was going to be insufferable about the crutches. Marcus came for something else. He sat down across from her in one of the orange plastic chairs that lined the waiting room wall, and he had a paper cup of coffee in each hand, and he set one in front of her without asking if she wanted it. She picked it up. It was terrible coffee, the kind that came from a machine that hadn't been cleaned in 2 months, and she drank half of it in one pull. "We found the coordinator," Marcus said. She set the cup down. "Found him where?" "Bus station in Modesto. Bought a ticket to El Paso at 11 this morning." He was watching her face. "He didn't make it to the bus." "What does that mean?" "It means 2 of our guys were at the station before he was." Marcus wrapped both hands around his own cup. He had large hands, scarred across the knuckles in the old way. Not recent damage, but the kind of accumulated evidence that accumulates over decades. "We have him." Maya looked at him steadily. "Have him where?" "Somewhere quiet." She understood what that meant, and she let it sit between them without touching it, because touching it would require her to respond to it, and she wasn't sure yet what her response was. The man she was sitting across from was not a criminal in the way she understood criminals. He was also not operating inside the system she understood as governing what happened to people who did wrong things. He was somewhere in a third territory she didn't have a clean map for. "Is he talking?" she said. "Not yet." A pause. "He will." She thought about what Marcus had told her on the bike, the condemned building, the disappeared inspector, the man walking away from the north side. "Who hired him?" she said. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. The waiting room around them was mostly empty. A woman with a sleeping child across 2 chairs, an elderly man with a bandaged hand, a nurse moving through without looking at anyone. Private enough. "That's the question," he said. "The coordinator's name is Owen Pruitt. He's done event logistics for veterans organizations for 6 years. Clean record, no known affiliations." He drank his coffee. His phone shows 14 calls to a number that traces back to a prepaid burner purchased in Sacramento 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks before the charity ride. 3 weeks before the charity ride. She felt something cold settle in her chest. Not fear exactly, more the specific chill of a pattern becoming visible. "Someone planned this," she said. "Someone planned this." For Gideon specifically. Marcus didn't answer, but his jaw tightened by a fraction, and that fraction was its own answer. Outside the waiting room's single window, the California evening had gone the color of a bruise, dark purple at the horizon, fading to gray overhead. A few drops of rain had started against the glass, tentative, like they hadn't committed to it yet. She watched them track down the pain. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. Marcus looked at his cup. "Because you were in that building. Because whoever arranged that collapse may not know you survived. And because you are going to go back to your life tomorrow, and you are not going to know what you're walking back into." She absorbed this. "You think I'm in danger?" "I think you're a loose end," he said. "And I think loose ends make certain kinds of people uncomfortable." The rain against the window made up its mind and became serious. She listened to it for a moment, the way it changed the quality of the silence in the room. "I want to talk to him," she said. "Pruitt." Marcus looked at her. "You were in there with iron," she said. "Whatever Pruitt knows, whatever the reason is, whatever the name at the end of those 14 phone calls is, I was in that building too. That makes it my business." She held his gaze. "Doesn't it?" A very long pause. Marcus studied her the way she imagined he had studied a great many situations across a great many years, with the unhurried, comprehensive attention of a man who had learned that the cost of a wrong read was high. "It might," he said finally. "But tonight you're going home. Someone will follow to make sure you get there." "I don't need—" "It's not a request," he said. Not unkindly, just flatly. "Tonight you go home. Tomorrow we talk about what comes next." She wanted to argue. She looked at his face and understood that arguing would not produce a different outcome, only a longer conversation. She went home. The apartment was cold. She'd left the window cracked that morning, which was 14 hours ago, and felt like something that had happened to a different person in a different calendar year. And the rain had come in and dampened the sill and the carpet beneath it. She closed the window and stood in the dark of her living room and listened to the rain on the street outside. She didn't turn the lights on for a while. The leather jacket, Marcus's, she'd realized on the bike, though he hadn't asked for it back. She hung on the hook by the door. She stood in her ruined uniform, concrete dust and blood, and the chemical residue of the gas still in the fabric, and she looked at the photograph taped to her refrigerator. Danny, grinning, the missing tooth, the house with the red door. She'd been in a collapsing building today. She'd pulled a man out of it with her bare hands and a piece of rebar. She'd crawled back out through a gap that closed 30 seconds after she cleared it. And none of it, had felt as frightening as the thing Marcus had just told her in the hospital waiting room. Because the building was over. The building was done. But whoever had made 14 phone calls to a prepaid burner in Sacramento was not done. And Gideon Mercer was lying in a hospital bed right now. And anyone who wanted to finish what they'd started knew exactly where he was. She showered. She ate half a piece of bread standing over the sink because her body reminded her it existed. She sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the wall and thought about loose ends and what happened to them. She didn't sleep much. Marcus was at her door at 7 the next morning. He had 2 coffees, real ones this time, from somewhere that knew what it was doing, and a look on his face that had changed overnight in a way she couldn't immediately identify. Something had happened. Something between last night and this morning had shifted the set of his shoulders and the quality of his silence. "He talked," she said. "Get your jacket," Marcus said. The garage was in an industrial district east of town, tucked between a sheet metal fabricator and a storage facility, the kind of neighborhood that looked the same at 7 a.m. as it did at midnight and attracted no particular attention in either case. 8 bikes were parked outside in the rain. She recognized the geography of it, the careful placement, the angles that meant those bikes could see in all directions without appearing to be watching anything. Inside smelled like motor oil and damp concrete and cigarette smoke, the overhead fluorescents throwing everything in a flat, unflattering light that made everyone look like they hadn't slept. Which, she suspected, most of them hadn't. There were 12 men inside. She recognized 3. Marcus, a man named Dell, who she'd seen working on Gideon during the aftermath, and a younger man named Trace, who couldn't have been more than 25, and had a tension in his body that she read as barely managed rage. The others she didn't know yet. They were ranged around the garage in the particular configuration of men who are waiting for something and managing their waiting by doing other things. One was working on an engine, 2 were talking quietly near the back wall, 1 was doing absolutely nothing with the focused intentionality of someone who has learned that stillness is its own form of action. Owen Pruitt was zip-tied to a chair in the middle of the space. He was a slight man, mid-40s, with the look of someone who processed everything through an administrative distance, or had, before last night. That distance was gone now. He was pale and visibly shaking, and his eyes, when they found Maya's, had the hollow quality of someone who had looked at what he'd done and found it looking back. She stopped in front of him. Marcus stood 2 steps behind her and said nothing. "You were the coordinator," she said. Pruitt swallowed. "Yes." "You filed the inspection report." Yes. Someone sent it to me. Said it was done, said I just needed to submit it under my credentials. I didn't know." "You didn't know the building was condemned?" she said. "No." A pause. Too long. "Not at first." She let that hang. "When did you know?" she said. His eyes went to Marcus. Marcus gave him nothing. 2 days before the ride, Pruitt said, "I found the condemnation order in the county records. I called the number. The man I was working with. I told him I couldn't, that I needed to pull the event, that people could get hurt." His voice was unraveling at the edges. He said if I pulled out, he'd make sure certain things about my past came out. Things that would... He stopped. "I have a family." "So does Gideon Mercer," Maya said. Her voice came out flatter than she intended. She didn't correct it. Pruitt flinched. "I know." "Who hired you?" A different silence this time, the kind with weight and shape. Around the garage, the quality of stillness changed. She could feel it, the men's attention sharpening to a single point. "His name," Pruitt said slowly, "is Calhoun, Dennis Calhoun." He looked at his hands, the zip ties, the floor. "He runs a property development company out of Sacramento, Castle Ridge Development." Another swallow. "He's been trying to acquire the Iron Angels compound for 2 years. The land it sits on, it's in the path of a commercial corridor project, worth about $11 million if he can clear the title." The garage was very quiet. "The club owns that land," Marcus said from behind Maya. His voice was controlled in the way that very dangerous things are controlled. "The club owns it, but Mercer personally holds the deed," Pruitt said. "Has for 30 years. Calhoun made 3 offers. All 3 were declined." He looked up at last. Calhoun's approach is, he's not someone who accepts declined offers. Maya looked at him. "So he decided to remove the man holding the deed." Pruitt said nothing. His silence confirmed it. She turned away from him. She needed to turn away from him because the thing happening in her chest, the hot, rising pressure of it, was going to come out of her face in a way she couldn't afford right now. She walked to the far side of the garage and put her back against the wall and looked at the ceiling and breathed. $11 million. A property development company. 14 phone calls to a prepaid burner. A condemned building cleared on paper and loaded with a gas leak, an old wiring, and a charity ride that put the target inside it at a specific, predictable time. Someone had tried to kill Gideon Mercer for real estate. She heard Marcus moving, heard him say something to Trace in a low voice, heard the garage door open partway, letting in a stripe of gray, rainy morning, and then she heard something else. Something that made her come off the wall and move back toward the center of the space. Her phone was ringing. She almost didn't recognize the ringtone because the specific combination of the number and the hour was something she'd been waiting for weeks and had stopped expecting. She pulled the phone from her jacket pocket. "Briggs, the caseworker." She answered. "Miss Rowan." His voice had its usual quality of compressed bureaucratic endurance. "I'm calling because I received a notice this morning from the placement facility regarding your brother." She turned away from the men in the garage, not for privacy. There wasn't any. But because she needed to not be looked at for this. "What kind of notice?" "Daniel's current foster family has given notice that they're unable to continue the placement." A pause filled with the sound of papers being moved. "Effective end of the month. 12 days. "Where's he going?" "We're working on identifying an appropriate next placement. Given Daniel's history of..." "His history is 3 placements in 2 years," she said. "His history is being moved." She pressed the heel of her free hand against the bridge of her nose. "I'm still working on the housing situation. I have a court date scheduled for..." "Ms. Rowan." Briggs's voice carried the specific exhaustion of someone who had this conversation regularly. "The court date is in 6 weeks. Without documented stable housing at the time of the hearing, I know what happens without it. I just want to make sure we're aligned on the timeline." She closed her eyes. "Is there anything I can do to accelerate the housing documentation? Any expedited process?" A pause. "Not within the standard framework, no." She thanked him. She hung up. She stood with the phone in her hand for a moment, in the middle of a garage that smelled like oil and cigarettes, and the residue of a very recent crisis, surrounded by men she hadn't known 48 hours ago, and she thought about Danny drawing the same house over and over, the red door, the 2 of them standing in front of it, grinning, 12 days before another move, 6 weeks before the hearing, no documented housing, no way to accelerate the timeline within the standard framework. She put her phone in her pocket and turned back to the room. Marcus was watching her. She didn't know how much of the call he'd been able to follow, but he'd heard enough. She could see it in his face, the slight shift of attention. "Your brother," he said. Not a question. "Not your problem," she said. Something moved across his face. He started to say something, she could see it forming, and then Trace came through the side door with his phone in his hand and a look on his face that stopped everything in the room. "We've got a problem," Trace said. Marcus turned. "What kind?" "The hospital kind." Trace's voice was young and controlled and very tight. "Someone just tried to get into Iron's room." The sound in the garage changed, not louder, quieter, with the specific quality of a silence that precedes action. "Staff stopped them," Marcus said. "Cleaning crew worker. Had a hospital ID, except the hospital has no record of that employee." Trace looked at his phone. "Security pulled the footage. The man in the footage is not in any of the hospital's employment records. He walked in with a cart, went to the oncology wing on floor 4, tried a key card on Iron's door, and when it didn't work..." "Which room is Iron in?" Maya said. Everyone looked at her. "He's not on oncology," she said. "They put him in orthopedics, floor 2. She'd walked past the board herself last night, room 214. She'd walked past it 3 times without going in, because Ruth was there, because she hadn't known what she would say. Marcus understood immediately. She watched it happen in his face, the recognition, the calculation. "They have the wrong floor," he said. "For now," Trace said. Marcus pulled out his phone. It was already dialing before he finished turning toward the door. 3 other men moved with him. Not hurried, but with the dense, coordinated purpose of people who have run operations and know that speed without coordination is just chaos in a hurry. "He needs to be moved," Maya said. "He needs to be moved," Marcus agreed, phone to his ear. "And he needs to know," she said, "about Calhoun, about the land, about all of it. Because if Calhoun sent someone to the hospital this fast, it means he knows the collapse didn't work, and it means he's accelerating." Marcus looked at her over the phone. His expression said, "Yes, I know." And it also said, "This is already more than I wanted you in the middle of." "I want to come," she said. "Maya." "He talked to me," she said. "In the building. I know how to talk to him." She held Marcus's gaze. "You know I'm right. You're taking me anyway. The only question is whether we spend the next 2 minutes arguing about it." Another long look. The kind that involves a great deal of compressed and rapid evaluation. "Get your jacket," he said. The drive to the hospital was 12 minutes in the rain. She was on the back of Marcus's bike again, and the rain hit cold and flat, and she kept her head down behind his shoulder and thought about Calhoun, a name she hadn't known 20 minutes ago, a name that now sat in her chest like a stone she'd swallowed. Dennis Calhoun, Castle Ridge Development. $11 million and 2 declined offers, and then a third approach, the kind that didn't involve an offer at all. She thought about the man with the cleaning cart, the wrong floor, the key card that hadn't worked. She thought about what happened when the man went back and got better information. She thought about room 214, floor 2, and about Ruth, who was probably in the chair beside the bed right now, and who had spent 8 years navigating the rooms in her husband she couldn't find her way into, and who was not going to be prepared for a man with a hospital ID and a cart and intentions that had nothing to do with cleaning. They pulled into the hospital parking structure and Marcus killed the engine. He was on the phone again before his helmet was off, coordinating, directing, the specific language of someone who runs an operation with a lot of moving parts. She caught fragments, chapters, coverage, eyes on the exit, a machine activating. She went ahead of him, through the parking structure, through the hospital's side entrance, into the elevator, floor 2, orthopedics. The hallway when she stepped out of the elevator was quiet, institutional, the overhead lights, the particular blue-white of a space that doesn't know what time it is. Room 214 was at the end of the corridor. She was 20 feet from the door when she saw Ruth in the hallway, standing outside the room, arms crossed, talking to a nurse. Ruth's body language was the language of someone managing a difficult conversation with patients they were running out of. She was 10 feet from the door when she saw, through the small square window in it, the room was not empty of anyone except Gideon. There was a man in a blue maintenance uniform on the far side of the bed. He had his back to the door and he was doing something with his hands, something that wasn't cleaning, something precise and small that she couldn't fully see. She hit the door with her shoulder. The man spun. He was 40, maybe 45, with the flat, practiced face of someone who had done difficult things before and had made a kind of internal armistice with the difficulty. His right hand was at his side and in it was something small in glass. A syringe, she saw, uncapped, the plunger drawn. Gideon was in the bed, sedated from the surgery, the leg elevated, an IV in his left arm. His eyes were half open, that specific sedation half-consciousness, aware enough to know something was wrong, not aware enough to do anything about it. The man with the syringe looked at Maya. Maya looked at the syringe. The IV line was in Gideon's left arm. The man was on the left side of the bed. He was 2 seconds from whatever he'd come to do, and she was 12 feet away, and behind her she could hear Ruth saying her name from the hallway, the alarm in it. The man made a decision. She could see it happen. The eyes going flat, the shoulders settling, the kind of look that precedes a committed action. She crossed the 12 feet. She didn't think about it. She didn't plan it. She hit the arm with the syringe from below, palm up, driving his wrist up and back, and her other hand found the IV line and pulled it, not out, just disconnected from the drip, away from the port, buying the second she needed. The syringe flew. He grabbed her arm with his free hand and she felt the grip, and it was hard, harder than she'd expected. and she understood in the specific physical language of that grip that this man was not going to let go easily, and that she had done something she could not undo, and the room was very small, and Ruth was in the doorway screaming for someone, and Gideon was trying to sit up and failing, and the man was pulling her toward him, and his other hand was going for something at his back. And then Marcus came through the door. What happened after that was fast and certain, and she looked away from it because there were things she already knew about herself that she wanted to keep knowing, and one of them was where her line was. When she looked back, the man was on the floor, and Marcus was standing over him, and two other iron angels were filling the doorway, and the syringe was on the floor under the bed, and Gideon was sitting up at 45 degrees with an expression on his face that was fully awake. Not sedation half-consciousness, but the hard, clear eyes of a man who had been in the field long enough to come to attention from any level of incapacitation when the situation required it. He looked at Maya. She was standing at the foot of his bed with her arms at her sides and her breathing coming in controlled pulls, because if she let her breathing go, the rest of her was going to follow, and she couldn't afford that right now. There was a red mark on her forearm from the man's grip that was going to be a bruise by morning. "That's the second time," Gideon said. His voice was rough from the anesthesia and very steady. "You keep showing up." "Someone has to," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, then at Marcus, then at the man on the floor. His jaw tightened and something moved behind his eyes. A reckoning, she thought. The specific internal recalibration of a man who has just understood the full dimensions of the thing he's in. "Close the door," he said. Marcus closed it. "Tell me," Gideon said. Marcus told him. All of it. Calhoun, the land, the prepaid burner, Owen Pruitt in the chair in the garage. He delivered it the way she suspected he'd delivered a great many bad reports in a great many difficult rooms. Without cushioning, without editorializing, in the flat sequential order of facts that built to a conclusion. Gideon listened. He didn't interrupt. The only movement he made was a single slow press of his fist against the bed rail, once, at the point where Marcus said the word Calhoun. When Marcus finished, the room was quiet. "He knows I survived," Gideon said. He knew within the hour. Probably had someone at the scene. "He sent this one fast." Gideon looked at the man on the floor. "That means he's worried about what I know, what I'll do." He looked up. "He's right to be worried." "We need to get you out of here," Marcus said. "I know." Gideon's eyes went to Maya. They stayed there for a moment, that same winter sky directness, the same quality of attention that saw more than most people were comfortable being seen. "You disconnected the IV," he said. "Yes." "Fast thinking." "I've done clinical rotations." "In a building collapse," he said, "and now in a hospital room." A pause. "Maya." He said her name like he'd been holding it for a while and had finally found the right moment to put it down. "Are you all right?" The question arrived in the middle of everything else. The man on the floor, the syringe under the bed, the $11 million, and the 14 phone calls in Danny's 12 days. And it landed with the full weight of being the first time anyone had asked it today. She thought about saying yes. The word was right there. "No," she said. "But I don't have time for that right now." Gideon looked at her for another long moment. Then he nodded. Once, decisively. "Neither do I," he said. "So let's work the problem." He pushed himself upright with his arms, wincing as the movement pulled the leg, and looked at Marcus. "I need clothes. I need out of this building, and I need everything you have on Calhoun's operation. Properties, associates, financials if you can get them." He reached out and pulled the call button out of the wall socket with a quick, deliberate motion. "And I need someone to find out if Calhoun knows about her." He meant Maya. She understood why he was asking. If Calhoun had someone at the collapse site, and if that person had seen her crawl out of the building, and if Pruitt had told anyone about the waitress who'd gone in after the president, then the loose end Marcus had mentioned was already on someone's list. She understood this. What she understood next was harder. Because if she was on Calhoun's list, then she wasn't the only one. Danny was 11 years old and in a foster home 40 minutes south, and he was the only person in the world that Maya Rowan would absolutely, certainly, without any possibility of calculation or hesitation, do anything to protect. And Calhoun, whoever he was, whatever he'd built, and however he'd built it, was the kind of man who would know that. She reached out and picked the syringe up from under the bed, using the hem of her shirt, and set it carefully on the bedside table. Evidence. She looked at what was in it, clear, slightly viscous, a volume that told her exactly what it had been intended for. "We need to move Danny," she said. Everyone in the room looked at her. "My brother," she said. "He's in foster care, group home in Riverside. If Calhoun finds out about me, if he already knows—" She stopped. Not because she couldn't say it, but because saying it would make it the most real thing in the room, more real than the man on the floor, or the syringe, or Calhoun's $11 million. Gideon said, "Marcus." Marcus said, "Already on it." She looked at him. He had his phone out. He met her eyes and she saw in his the things she had not expected to find in a room like this, in a situation like this, from a man like him. The uncomplicated steadiness of someone who has decided a thing and is doing it. No negotiation, no conditions, just on it. She pressed the heel of her hand against her mouth for a moment. Just a moment. Then she took her hand away and looked at Gideon. "Tell me what you need me to do," she said. Gideon Mercer, lying in a hospital bed with a broken leg and a dressed head wound, and the full knowledge that a man in Sacramento had spent 3 weeks engineering his death, looked at the 22-year-old waitress who had now saved his life twice in 24 hours, and said, "Are you sure?" She thought about the house with the red door, about the checklist that had kept her moving through 14 months of suspended life, about the gap in the rubble, 16 inches wide, and the hand in the dark reaching out, about what it had meant that she had reached back. "I've been sure about the wrong things my whole life," she said. "This is the first time being sure has actually felt like something." She looked at him steadily. "So yes, tell me what you need." Gideon held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Then something in his face, not softened exactly, but resolved, like a thing long held in suspension, finally finding its settled state. And he said, "Then we start with Calhoun's money." Outside the room, down the corridor, an elevator opened. She could hear it, the mechanical chime, then footsteps, then the sound of a radio, low and official. Hospital security. Finally. Late, she thought. As systems always were, as they had always been for her and for Danny, and for the man in the bed in front of her, and for every person who had ever needed something from the framework and found the framework arriving after the moment had already passed. But behind those footsteps, further down, from the stairwell door, she heard it, the sound of boots. Multiple pairs, heavy and deliberate, the specific rhythm of men who moved together because they had learned to, in places where the cost of not moving together was paid in the worst currency available. Iron angels. The rest of them arriving. And in the bed, Gideon Mercer straightened his back. Slowly, carefully, with the controlled effort of a man operating at the absolute limit of what his body was currently willing to offer, and became, fully and without remainder, the president again. "Close the blinds," he said, "and somebody find out where Calhoun is sleeping tonight." They moved Gideon at 11:15 p.m., not in an ambulance, not through the front entrance, through the loading dock on the hospital's east side in a wheelchair that he despised and sat in, without complaint because Marcus had used the specific tone that meant this was not a negotiable point, and Gideon Mercer had built 30 years of functional brotherhood on knowing which battles to pick. The loading dock smelled like wet cardboard and diesel, and the rain had settled into a steady, serious business that flattened everything under it. Sound, light, the edges of things. 4 bikes waited outside. Engines off. The men beside them were standing in the rain without hoods because hoods limited peripheral vision, and none of these men were willing to limit their peripheral vision tonight. Maya was in the middle of it. She had stopped trying to locate the edge of the situation, the point where her involvement ended and their world began, because that edge had stopped being visible somewhere around the moment she'd crossed 12 feet of hospital room floor to knock a syringe out of a man's hand. She was in it. The geometry of it had closed around her, and she had, somewhere between room 214 and the loading dock, made her peace with that. She helped Marcus get Gideon into the sidecar of a modified Heritage Softail that belonged to a man named Briggs. Not her caseworker, a different Briggs. This one 6'3" with a gray beard and a silver star tattoo on the back of his left hand. The irony of the name she filed somewhere in the back of her mind and left there. "The compound?" she said to Marcus. "Too obvious. Calhoun's people have probably had it under surveillance for a week." I was checking something on his phone, his face lit from below in the rain, water tracking down the lines of it. "We're going to Denton's. It's clean." She didn't ask who Denton was. She was learning when to ask and when to move. They rode north out of the city in a loose formation, the kind that didn't look like a formation to anyone watching from a distance. She was on Marcus's bike again, and the rain was a cold, continuous presence, and the highway was mostly empty at this hour. She watched the other bikes in her peripheral vision and thought about Calhoun, where he was, what he knew, how fast the man from room 214 would be able to communicate that the second attempt had also failed. Fast. The answer was fast, because men like Calhoun didn't build $11 million property operations on slow communication. Her phone buzzed in her jacket pocket. She pulled it out one-handed, tilted it to read in the wind and the rain. It was a text from a number she didn't have saved. 4 words. "Danny is with us." She stared at it long enough that Marcus said from the front of the bike, "Everything okay?" She put the phone back. "Yes," she said. It was the first time in 2 days that she'd said it and meant it. Denton's turned out to be a ranch property 40 minutes north of the city, set back from the highway behind a screen of eucalyptus that had grown tall enough to make the house invisible from the road. The house itself was low and sprawling, the kind of California ranch construction that had been built in the 60s for a family, and then expanded over decades with the particular organic logic of a place that had absorbed a great many people's needs. The lights were on, trucks in the yard, more bikes than she could count in the dark. Inside was warmth and controlled chaos and the smell of coffee at industrial scale. She counted at least 40 men in the main room alone. Men from multiple chapters. She could see it in the patches. Sacramento and Riverside and the Coast chapter she now recognized as Ruth's. They were grouped in the particular configurations of people who had a shared purpose and were working out their individual pieces of it, phones and laptops and maps spread on the kitchen table and the 2 folding tables that had been set up beside it, conversations and low voices that went quiet when she came in and then resumed. She was aware of being looked at, not hostilely. She understood that the look had a specific content, that it said, "We know who you are and why you're here, and we're still processing what that means." She held it without deflecting. She'd been looked at her whole life by people deciding what category she fit into. She could handle being looked at. Gideon was already installed in a recliner in the corner of the main room with his leg elevated and a cup of coffee and a laptop, and he was talking to 2 men she hadn't seen before, older, with the particular bearing of men who had run things and still knew how. She didn't interrupt. She went to the kitchen and poured her own coffee and stood at the edge of the organized chaos and listened. Within 20 minutes, she had the shape of it. Calhoun owned Castle Ridge Development, but Castle Ridge was a shell sitting on top of a more complex structure, a network of LLCs and holding companies that Trace, who turned out to have a degree in finance that he'd never mentioned, had spent the night tracing through public records and some other records that were less public. The compound's land, the Iron Angel's property, 32 acres in the valley, the land Gideon had bought piece by piece over 15 years and held in his own name, sat at the center of a commercial corridor development that Calhoun had been assembling for 4 years. Without that parcel, the corridor couldn't be completed. Without the corridor, Calhoun couldn't deliver on commitments he'd apparently already made to 3 institutional investors. He wasn't just greedy. He was exposed. He'd pre-sold the development, and now he couldn't complete it without land that wasn't for sale. "How much is he in for?" she heard someone ask. "The investor commitments are around $40 million, Trace said. "If the corridor falls through, he eats the whole thing." $40 million. She absorbed that number. It changed the shape of the threat. Not larger exactly, but more desperate. A greedy man was dangerous in a calculated way. A desperate man was dangerous in an unpredictable one. "He won't stop," she said. She hadn't meant to say it aloud, but the room's acoustics were better than she'd realized, and the nearest cluster of men looked at her. She continued because she'd started. "He can't stop. If he stops, the investors find out, the corridor collapses, he loses $40 million and probably everything else. So every hour we don't end this, he's recalculating, sending another person, another approach." She looked at Trace. "Does he know where the compound is?" "He's tried to buy it, so yes." "Is anyone there right now?" A beat. 2 men exchanged a look. 6 prospects, Marcus said from across the room. "Young guys, not fully patched. We left them there to maintain presence." 6 prospects. Young and unpatched, which meant untested and not fully trained, left at a property that a desperate man with $40 million on the line had a specific reason to target. She looked at Marcus. He was already on his phone. The call connected, and then the sound that came out of it was wrong. She could tell from across the room, from the way Marcus's face changed, the way his posture shifted, that the sound was wrong before she could hear what it was. He crossed the room in 4 strides. He didn't hand her the phone. He put it on speaker on the kitchen table, and the sound came out into the room. A young man's voice, breathless and ragged and trying very hard to be steady. 3 vehicles. They came in through the back fence. I've got Reyes and Cole. Static. A sound she identified after a half-second as breaking glass. They're inside the shop. The line went unclear. Not dead. She could still hear background, could hear something that might have been shouting, muffled. The room had gone completely silent. Marcus said, "Donnie, talk to me." The voice came back, lower. "They're between us and the bikes. We're in the back office. There's..." A pause with something physical in it, a caught breath. "Reyes is cut. I need..." "How bad?" Marcus said. I don't know. He won't look at it. He's..." "Listen to me." Marcus's voice was the flattest, most controlled thing in the room. "You stay in that office. You put something against the door. You do not come out. We're 20 minutes out." Silence from the phone. "Donnie." "They're going to take the bikes," the voice said. Very quiet. "They're going to take the bikes and the files and..." "Let them take the bikes," Marcus said. "You hear me? Let them take whatever they want. You stay in that room. You stay alive. 20 minutes. He hung up. He turned. The room was already in motion. She could feel it. The shift. The activation of something that had been coiled and waiting. Men moving for gear, for phones, for keys. The specific low-frequency sound of a group of people who have done this before getting ready to do it again. Gideon's voice came from the recliner. "Marcus." Marcus turned. "All of it," Gideon said. "Every chapter that can move tonight moves tonight." His voice was even and absolute. "This ends now, Sam." She was not supposed to go. This was made clear to her by Marcus in approximately 15 words, none of which she gave a great deal of weight to, because 15 words was not enough to address the specific logic of her situation. If she stayed at Denton's, she was a person waiting. If she went, she was a person who could do something with her hands. She had always been better at doing than waiting. 14 months of necessary waiting had not changed that about her. Also, she knew what Reyes's cut might need, and the men getting on their bikes right now did not. She found a first aid kit under Denton's bathroom sink, and she put it in her jacket, and she got on Marcus's bike before he had finished the sentence that was supposed to be the final reason she should stay behind, and after a moment, a long, weighted, 2-second moment, he started the engine. They went south in a column of 23 bikes and 2 trucks, and the rain was still coming, and the headlights cut through it in parallel lines, and Maya leaned into the wind and felt her heartbeat in her hands. 17 minutes. The compound came into view dark. That was wrong. The compound should have had its perimeter lights on. She'd seen them the one time she'd ridden past it. Amber floods at the fence corners, the kind of practical security lighting that said occupied and aware. Now it was dark, and the gate at the road was open, and there were 2 SUVs parked at angles inside the fence that had not been there before. Marcus killed his headlight half a mile out. The column followed, not all at once, sequentially, the headlights going dark one by one until they were rolling in near silence and near darkness, navigating by the ambient light of the overcast sky and the occasional sweep of passing trucks on the highway behind them. She felt him change his breathing, felt it through the jacket, through the contact between her arms around his torso, the deliberate, controlled deepening, in through the nose, hold, out through the mouth. She recognized it. She did it herself. They stopped at 200 yards. Men dismounted and moved forward on foot, and the darkness absorbed them in the particular way that men in dark clothing moving with intention get absorbed by night. Not invisibly, but as though the night had a tolerance for them, had made accommodation. Maya stayed with Marcus. He'd stopped arguing about it. That was its own kind of acceptance. 3 vehicles, he said quietly. The 2 SUVs inside and 1 more that's not visible yet. Could be around the back. How many people? Pruitt said Calhoun uses a private security firm, ex-military mostly. He scanned the compound fence line. 5 to 8, probably. She looked at the dark windows of the shop building, the long, low structure at the compound's center, where the bikes lived and the records were kept, and somewhere at the back, 3 young men and a cut that might or might not need stitches. "They're still in the office?" she said. "I don't know." He checked his phone. Nothing from Donnie since the call. "I need to go in." "I know." "You need to stay here." She looked at him. The first aid kit was solid weight inside her jacket. The compound fence was chain link, and there was a section at the far right that had been replaced with a different gauge, newer, slightly shinier even in this dark, like a repair that hadn't weathered yet. A weak point, or an entry point, if you were small enough and fast enough, and knew how chain link behaved when you put your full weight on the top rail. "Donnie said Reyes won't look at the cut," she said. "That means it's bad enough that Reyes won't look at it, which means someone needs to go to the back office." Marcus looked at the fence section she was looking at, looked at her. "You go in through there," he said. "You go straight to the back office. You do not stop for anything." "I know. I mean it. Whatever you hear, whatever's happening—" "Marcus." He stopped. "I know," she said. He held her gaze for a second. Then he turned away and began moving forward, and she went right, toward the fence line. Well, the chain link was cold and wet and bit into her palms. She went over it fast, the way she'd climbed the chain link fence behind the apartment complex when she was 14 and Danny was 3, and she needed to get to the street quickly because the man inside had decided he was going to be a problem. Different fence, same velocity. She landed inside the compound in a crouch and waited. Nothing moved. She could hear sounds from the shop building, something heavy being moved, a voice she didn't recognize giving instructions she couldn't make out at this distance. She oriented herself. Main gate to her left, shop building directly ahead. The back office access through the shop or through the side door she could see on the building's right flank. Side door. She moved along the fence line, staying low, keeping the parked bikes between herself and the shop's main windows. The rain masked her sound. She was grateful for the rain. She'd been grateful for the rain before in her life, in the specific way that people who have needed cover know to be grateful for it. The side door was unlocked. The people inside had not expected anyone to come in this way, because they had not expected anyone to come from outside at all tonight. She understood the logic of that. Calhoun's team would have surveilled the compound, counted the bikes, confirmed that most of the chapter was off property. They'd have thought they had a window. They'd been wrong about the window by 17 minutes. She pushed the side door open by inches, enough to slide through, and she was in the side corridor of the shop building. A narrow passage that ran along the back wall, used for storage, stacked with boxes of parts and old records and the general accumulated material of a space that had been in use for a long time. She could smell the shop now, oil and metal and rubber and old wood, undercut by the rain coming in from somewhere, probably a window they'd come through. The back office was at the end of the corridor. She could see the faint line of light under the door. Ahead of her, on the other side of the interior wall, she could hear them. 3 voices at least. Unhurried. The sound of drawers being opened, of a filing cabinet being worked. Not destructive, not ransacking, looking for something specific. She moved to the back office door and knocked twice, soft, then once, then twice. A pattern. Nothing. She knocked again. And the same pattern. A long pause. Then, "Who is it?" Young voice, tight with control. "Maya," she said. It doesn't matter. Marcus sent me. I have a first aid kit. Open the door." Another pause. Then the sound of something heavy being shifted. A desk, she thought, or a cabinet. And the door opened. Donnie was 23 years old and trying very hard not to show that his hands were shaking. He had a cut on his chin she hadn't expected, shallow, already clotting. He looked at her, at the first aid kit she was pulling from her jacket, and his face did something complicated that he immediately controlled. Behind him, Reyes was sitting on the floor with his back against the far wall. He was looking at the ceiling. There was a cut on his right forearm that had gone through his jacket sleeve, and he was holding it closed with his other hand and not looking at it, with the specific avoidance of someone who has decided that not looking is the only form of control currently available to him. Cole, the third one, was beside him, 18 at the absolute most, white as paper. She went to Reyes first. She said, "I need to look at it." "It's fine," he said to the ceiling. "That's not information," she said. "That's a preference. Let me look." He looked at her. Dark eyes, 21 or 22. The particular combination of pride and fear that she'd seen on the VA ward on the young ones, the ones who had not yet made peace with being hurt. She held his gaze and kept her face level, because level was what this required. He moved his hand. It was deep, not arterial. The blood was dark and the flow was manageable. But it was going to need closure, and it was going to need it soon. She opened the kit and found the wound closure strips, and the gauze, and the antiseptic, and she said, "This is going to hurt." And he said, "I know." And she believed him, and she did what needed doing. She was finishing the pressure wrap when the sound outside changed. Not louder. She would have expected louder, would have expected the arrival of 23 bikes to sound like what it was. But the sound that came was not that. It was a controlled series of thumps, and then a voice, not Marcus's, a different voice, closer. And then the particular sharp percussive report of something she'd heard in the VA ward patient's descriptions often enough to recognize it. A single shot. Reyes moved to get up. She put one hand on his shoulder. "Stay." "But, stay," she said. "You're not stable. You get up and that arm opens again." She looked at Donnie. "Do not open this door until Marcus knocks. You'll know it's him." "How will I know?" she told him. 4 knocks, a pause, 2 more. The same pattern she'd learned watching men communicate in hallways where the wrong knock brought the wrong answer. She didn't wait for him to confirm it. She went back to the corridor. The shop floor was lit now. Someone had hit the overheads, and the fluorescence buzzed to life and threw everything in that same flat blue-white that made people look like they hadn't slept. She came out of the corridor into the edge of it and stopped. There were 4 of them. Calhoun's security. She could see it in the gear, the tactical vests, the coordinated positioning that said trained and working. They were mid-action, 2 near the filing cabinets, 1 at the shop's main doors, 1 in the center of the floor who was looking at Marcus. Marcus was 5 feet inside the main doors. Alone. Visibly alone. Though she understood that alone was not the actual situation, that the actual situation was deployed around the perimeter of the building in ways she couldn't see. He had his hands visible and empty, and he was looking at the man in the center of the floor with the expression of someone who has done this exact calculation before and knows exactly how many variables are in it. "You need to walk away," Marcus said. His voice was conversational. She'd heard that tone in a great many places, and it always meant the opposite of conversational. The man in the center was speaking into a radio. She caught fragments. "Negative contact, structure secure. We have..." And then her position changed because she moved, instinctively, to a better angle, and the man near the filing cabinet saw her. He was fast. She'd expected trained but not fast. She was behind a tool cabinet before he'd fully committed to movement, and she heard him call out to the others. And then the geometry of the room changed, all of it at once. The main doors came in, not just Marcus, 6 men, 8 men. The specific organized force of people who had been positioned and were now executing, and the shop floor became a space where every angle had a new occupant, and the tactical calculation that Calhoun's team had been working from was no longer the operating map. She stayed behind the cabinet. She could track it by sound, the specific sounds of men fighting who know how to fight, which was different from the sounds of men fighting who don't, and she had enough clinical distance from it to be useful rather than reactive. She was looking for something specific, the radio. The man who'd been using it had dropped it when the doors came in. She could see it on the floor, 6 feet to her left, in the open. She needed that radio. Because the radio meant a frequency, and the frequency meant whoever was on the other end, and whoever was on the other end might be close to the compound and might have received the last transmission. And if the last transmission had included anything about her, she needed to know what it had said. She went for it. The 6 feet of open floor took about 3 seconds, which was 2 seconds longer than she would have liked, because the man near the filing cabinet had recovered and was moving in her direction, and she was not a fighter in any trained sense, and she knew it. She got the radio in her hand, and she was turning back toward the cabinet when the man reached her. He grabbed her arm, the same bruise from room 214, and she made a sound she didn't intend. And he turned her toward him, and she saw his face, mid-30s, professional. the flat expression of someone executing a task. "The girl," he said, into the space. Not to her, to the room. And from somewhere in the fighting, she heard someone stop. She heard the particular stopping of someone who had just heard those two words in that particular sequence. She heard Marcus say, very low and very close to something he did not often let come through in his voice, "Let her go." The man looked at Marcus across the shop floor. He was doing the calculation. She could see him doing it, the rapid assessment of positions and numbers and odds. The fight was mostly over. She could feel it in the room's quality, the settling of something. Calhoun's team had not anticipated this. They'd come in on the wrong math and they were losing the argument in real time. The man's grip on her arm did not loosen. "Call your men off," he said to Marcus. "Call them off." And she walks out of here. "She's already walking out of here," Marcus said. He took one step forward, one step, just one, and the quality of that step, the certainty of it, the complete absence of anything that could be read as hesitation, changed the temperature of the room. The man made a decision. She felt it in his grip, the change from holding to calculating a next move. And in that half second of recalculation, she moved, turning her body into the rotation the way a door moves on its hinge, using his own grip as the pivot point, and her elbow connected with something on the way through, and then she was clear, stumbling back, and Marcus was already there. What happened next was 4 seconds. At the end of those 4 seconds, the man was on the floor, and Marcus was standing, and his breathing was the controlled deep rhythm she'd felt on the bike, in and out, hold, and she was against the cabinet with the radio in her hand and her arm reporting very specific and detailed objections to recent events. The shop was quiet. Outside, beyond the walls, beyond the compound fence, she heard it, the sound of more engines. Not iron angels. Different cadence, different weight. She looked at Marcus. "That's more of them," she said. He looked at the man on the floor, looked at the other 3, subdued around the shop. Then he looked at her. "How many?" she said. He didn't know, she could tell. And not knowing was its own answer, because Marcus was the kind of man who planned for what he knew, and who, when he didn't know, showed it only in the absence of information rather than the presence of fear. She keyed the radio. Static, then a voice, different from the men in the shop, further away, with the particular ambient sound of a vehicle interior. "Team 2 in position. We have the east perimeter, waiting on your—" She clicked off. Looked at Marcus. "Team 2, she said. "East perimeter." The compound had 4 perimeter sides. She could see Marcus do the rapid restructure of the situation in real time, see him shift his weight, see his phone come out. "How many bikes can you move?" she said. "Right now, in the next 2 minutes." He looked at her. "Calhoun needs the land," she said. "He needs Gideon's signature on a transfer document, and he's not going to get it from Gideon, which means at some point tonight he's going to try to change the conversation into something that isn't about a transfer document anymore, into something he thinks Gideon will trade the land to stop." She held his gaze. "He knows about me. The man in the shop said it, the girl. His team knows I exist. And if Gideon's not at the hospital, and I'm not at Denton's, and his team is at this compound—" She stopped, because Marcus's face had gone to a place she hadn't seen it go before. "Denton's," he said. "Denton's," she said. He was already dialing. The phone rang 4 times, 5, 6. On the 7th ring, a voice she didn't recognize answered. Not a man she'd seen at Denton's. The voice had the wrong quality. Too careful, too flat. The quality of someone choosing each word. "Mercer Residence," the voice said. And Marcus stopped breathing. In the background of that call, very faintly, she heard something she had last heard 40 minutes ago and 40 minutes north of here. The particular creak of the recliner in the corner of Denton's main room, the one they'd installed Gideon in with his leg elevated and his coffee and his laptop. And then, closer, unmistakable, the sound of Ruth's voice, saying something she couldn't make out, in the tone of someone speaking carefully because they had been told to speak carefully. Marcus lowered the phone. His face was the face of a man who has just lost the variable he thought was protected, the one piece he had placed outside the board because he believed the board could not reach it. He looked at Maya. She looked back at him. "He has them," she said. Marcus said nothing for 3 full seconds. In those 3 seconds, the shop was completely silent, the men in it waiting, the engines outside still audible at the east perimeter, the rain still falling on the compound roof with its steady, indifferent percussion. Then he said, very quietly, quieter than she had ever heard him speak, which was its own kind of loud. "Get on a bike." She moved. I was already ahead of her, moving through the shop floor toward the main doors, and the men around them were falling in behind him. And she understood that they were going back to Denton's and that Calhoun had just changed the rules of the game from a property dispute into something that required a completely different response. She understood something else, too. Something that hit her as she pushed through the main doors of the shop into the rain-soaked compound. Something she hadn't fully understood until this moment, until she heard Ruth's voice on that phone in the wrong tone, speaking with the wrong care. The thing she understood was this: she was afraid. Not for herself. She had been afraid for herself in the building, in the hospital room, on the shop floor, and all of those fears had been workable, fears with edges she could locate and act around. This fear was different. This fear was the fear of someone who has found something they did not know they were missing and is now in the position of possibly losing it before they've had time to properly hold it. She was afraid for Gideon, for Ruth, for the structure of the thing she had been pulled into and had pulled herself further into, and had not, if she was being completely honest, resisted at any point with her full strength. She was afraid for the found thing, and that fear, she discovered, was the most clarifying thing she had ever felt in her life. More clarifying than the building, more clarifying than the hospital room, more clarifying than any of the checklist items she had spent 14 months moving toward. It cut through everything else and left only the next action. She got on a bike. The engine turned over under her hands, and the headlight came on, and the compound gate was open, and the road north was dark and wet, and the rain was still serious, and Marcus was already moving, and she went after him into the dark, because there was no version of this moment in which she did not. Behind her, the compound receded. Ahead of her, somewhere in the 40 minutes of California night between here and Denton's ranch, a man named Calhoun had made the worst miscalculation of a series of bad calculations. He had put his hands on people who were not his to touch, and he had done it in front of a woman who had crawled into a collapsing building for a stranger and come out the other side. And he had not yet understood what that meant. He was about to. The speedometer climbed. The rain hit her face, and she did not look away from it, and the column of bikes stretched out behind her in the dark like a sentence that had been waiting a very long time to reach its period. And the night ahead of them was cold and specific and absolutely, completely out of time. They smelled the smoke before they saw the lights. Not fire. Not the catastrophic, consuming kind she'd smelled at the Veterans Hall 2 days ago. This was smaller, controlled. The specific smell of something that had been burned deliberately and recently, and Maya caught it on the wind a quarter-mile out from Denton's and felt every muscle in her body tighten in the same instant. Marcus slowed. The column behind them compressed. She put her mouth close to his ear. They burned something. "I see it," he said. The eucalyptus screen was still intact, the house lights were still on, but above the tree line there was a faint smear of gray against the overcast sky, not thick enough to be structural, thin enough to be intentional. A message, maybe, or a demonstration. They went in with headlights off, the same way they'd approached the compound, and the column spread along the road's edge and men dismounted in silence. And the quality of that silence was different from the compound silence. It was heavier, weighted with what was inside it, with Ruth's voice on the phone and the particular wrongness of a man they didn't know answering a number only their own people had. Marcus held up a fist. The column stopped. He was on his phone, low and fast, coordinating with whoever he had positioned at Denton's perimeter, receiving. She watched his face in the dark and read it the way she'd learned to read the faces of people managing difficult information in difficult circumstances. The slight compression around the eyes when the news is bad. The jaw adjustment when the news requires immediate revision of a plan. "They're in the main house," he said quietly. 4 of Calhoun's people inside. Gideon and Ruth in the main room. 4 of ours, the ones who stayed, in the back of the property, unhurt. "Calhoun?" she said. "Inside." She absorbed this. Calhoun had come himself. That told her something. That the situation had moved past the point where he was comfortable managing it from a distance. That the failed collapse, and the failed hospital, and the failed compound had compelled him out of the architecture of delegation and into something more direct and therefore more desperate. Desperate men in rooms with hostages were a specific kind of problem. "He wants to talk to Gideon," Marcus said. "He's been asking for 30 minutes. "Then let him," she said. Marcus looked at her. Gideon is in that room, she said. He's injured and he's in a recliner and he's been running this operation from a hospital bed in a ranch house for the last 6 hours. If Calhoun wants to talk to him, that's Calhoun making a mistake. Because talking is not what Calhoun is good at. Property development is what he's good at. Intimidation through intermediaries is what he's good at. She kept her voice level. Put him in a room with Gideon Mercer, and it's not his room anymore. A long pause. Around them the night was cold and wet, and the eucalyptus moved in the wind, and the house sat 50 yards away with its lights on and its occupied rooms. You've known Gideon for 2 days, Marcus said. I know, she said. Am I wrong? He looked at the house. He looked at the column of men on the road behind them, 300 pounds each minimum, collective experience that spanned 3 decades of situations far worse than a Sacramento property developer with a desperate math problem and 4 hired men in a California ranch house. He wasn't wrong either. She knew that. She was asking him to hold back everything available to him and trust the man in the recliner, and that was not a small ask. Give him 10 minutes, she said. If it goes wrong, you go in. Marcus was quiet for 4 seconds. Then he pulled out his phone and made a call. The front door of Denton's house opened from the inside, and Maya walked through it first. This had not been the plan. The plan, insofar as there had been one in the 45 seconds of conversation in the dark, had involved her staying outside. But when the door opened and Calhoun's man was standing in it, and his eyes went past Marcus to her, and something in his expression shifted, recognition, she thought, the specific recognition of a person who has been briefed. She understood that walking in first was the correct move, because whatever Calhoun knew about her, whatever he'd decided she represented, it had made him uncertain. And uncertainty in a desperate man was the only leverage available that didn't require breaking anything further. She walked in. The main room of Denton's house looked different from the way she'd left it. The maps were still on the table, but they'd been pushed to one side. The folding tables were against the wall. The men who'd been working laptops were gone. Outside, she understood, repositioned. What remained was the essential geometry of a standoff. Gideon in the recliner in the corner, leg elevated, face composed in the particular stillness of a man conserving everything he has. Ruth in the chair beside him, back straight, hands in her lap. The look of a woman who has decided that fear is information and not a governing state. 2 of Calhoun's men positioned at the room's edges, and at the center, standing with the posture of someone performing confidence rather than possessing it, was Dennis Calhoun. He was younger than she'd expected. 50, maybe, with the expensive upkeep of someone who spent money on appearing 20 years into better shape than he was. Dark suit inappropriate for a ranch house at midnight. The face of a man who had gotten very good at boardrooms and was now in something that did not operate by boardroom logic. He looked at Maya when she came in. He looked at Marcus behind her. He did the count. You came a long way for a conversation, Calhoun said. You burned something in the yard, Maya said. He blinked. She'd addressed him first, which wasn't what he'd expected. Records, he said. Files from the compound. Nothing irreplaceable. Wrong, Gideon said from the recliner. His voice was the same as it had been in the hospital room. Even, awake, operating at full function from inside a body doing its best to fail him. Those were the original land survey documents from 1987. Took me 4 years to locate them. They're also on file with the county recorder's office, so the only thing you accomplished was telling me you don't do your research. Calhoun's jaw moved. A small thing. She watched it. I want to resolve this, Calhoun said. You tried to kill me, Gideon said. Twice. You've been in my house for 90 minutes with my wife. There's a version of this conversation where I'm interested in resolution. This is not that version. The land is not for sale. Flat, final. The period at the end of a sentence that had been said 3 times before and was being said for the last time. It has not been for sale. It will not be for sale. What it is the address where 347 men ride out of every year on a veterans charity run, and where my daughter's name is on a plaque on the workshop wall, and where I intend to be buried. He looked at Calhoun with the winter sky eyes, and they were fully open and completely without warmth. You have investors who are uncomfortable. That is a business problem. I am not the solution to your business problem. You don't understand what I I understand exactly what you can do, Gideon said. You've done most of it. I'm still here. The room was quiet. Calhoun's men at the edges were doing what men in untenable positions do, recalculating, watching the door, reading the room for the thing they'd missed. She could see it happening. They'd come in here on the math of 4-2, and it was no longer that math, and they knew it. Calhoun looked at Maya. She'd been watching him, and he knew it, and now he turned the full, evaluating weight of his attention on her. "You're the waitress," he said. "You're the developer," she said. "You know what happens to people who get in the way of transactions this size." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "A building fell on me 2 days ago. You sent someone to a hospital room. You had men at a compound, and now those men are on the floor of the compound shop." She let that sit. "I think we've established what happens." Something in Calhoun's performance cracked, not visibly, not in anything as dramatic as an expression or a gesture, but she'd spent 14 months reading the small signals of people who were maintaining a position they no longer fully believed, and she recognized the micro-event of a man who has just processed that his leverage is gone and has not yet decided what to do about that. Marcus stepped forward. She moved aside. "Here's what's going to happen," Marcus said. He crossed the room to the table, picked up a phone, Calhoun's phone, she could tell by the way Calhoun's eyes tracked it, and set it on the arm of Gideon's recliner. "You're going to call your investors. You're going to do it now, in this room, and you're going to tell them the corridor project is restructured, that the eastern parcel is not available, and you're identifying alternatives." He looked at Calhoun steadily. "Then your men are going to leave, and you're going to leave, and you're going to contact a lawyer in the morning. Not about the land, about yourself, about the things that are on record now. The inspection report, the prepaid phone, Owen Pruitt in a chair in a garage who has been talking for 18 hours. Calhoun stared at him. "You're not the law." "No," Marcus said. "But the law is coming. Whether that conversation happens before or after you walk out of here is the only part of tonight that's still yours to decide." A long silence. Calhoun stood in the middle of Denton's main room, and she watched him do what desperate men eventually do when every option has been worked through and none of them resolve in his favor. He stopped performing confidence, and what was underneath it was just a tired, frightened man who had overextended himself in a direction that had no road back. He made the call. She listened to him make it, and it was not dramatic. It was a man on a phone using careful language to describe a change in project parameters to someone on the other end who was not happy, and the unhappiness was audible even across the room, and Calhoun absorbed it with the face of someone absorbing a debt they have no choice but to acknowledge. When he hung up, the room let out a breath it had been holding. Calhoun's men left first. Then Calhoun. He paused at the door, and she thought he might say something, and then he didn't, and the door closed behind him, and that was the end of Dennis Calhoun and their story. Ruth made a sound from the chair beside Gideon. Not a word, just a sound, the specific release of a thing held tightly for a long time, finding its way out. She pressed 2 fingers to her mouth and looked at the ceiling, and then she looked at her husband. And the look between them was something Maya did not look directly at, because it was too private for witness. She went to the kitchen and poured coffee for everyone, because it was there, and it was something her hands could do. Danny was asleep on a couch in the back room. She found this when she went looking, following the direction a young man named Cole had indicated with a tilt of his head when she'd asked where they'd put her brother. The back room was a study of some kind, so it's books on 3 walls, a desk, the couch, a lamp with a warm amber bulb that was the kindest light she'd seen in 2 days. Danny was on his side with a blanket pulled up, his hair pushed sideways against the pillow cushion, his mouth slightly open. He was 11 years old. He'd been transported from his foster placement by 2 iron angels who had knocked on the door at 9 in the evening and told the foster family there'd been a family emergency, with enough calm authority that the foster family had simply complied. He'd arrived at Denton's confused and tired and asking for Maya, and someone, she didn't know who, and would spend a long time afterward being grateful for the anonymity of it, had sat with him until he fell asleep. She stood in the doorway for a while, just looked at him. The lamp made amber light on his face, and the blanket rose and fell with his breathing, and he was here, and he was whole, and the geometry that had been threatening to close around him for 12 days had not closed. She sat on the edge of the couch. She didn't wake him. She put her hand on his shoulder, lightly, and he shifted in his sleep and pressed back against it, the unconscious seeking of contact, and she felt the pressure of it in her chest in a way that bypassed every layer of control she'd spent the last 48 hours constructing and maintaining. She stayed there a long time. Well, the sun came up on a Thursday. She was on Denton's porch with a coffee she'd lost track of refilling when the sky started to change in the east. The slow, almost administrative process of California morning, arriving over the valley, gray first and then a line of copper at the horizon, and then the gradual warming of everything it touched. The eucalyptus stood in it, and the wet grass caught it, and the bikes parked in rows along the yard took on the particular quality that chrome has at dawn, which is the quality of things that have been through the night and survived it. Gideon was beside her. He'd maneuvered himself out in the crutches that Ruth had produced from somewhere inside the house. The man moved on crutches with a concentrated deliberateness that made them look less like medical devices and more like a deliberate slowing of something that normally moved too fast. He stood at the porch rail and looked at the morning and drank his coffee and didn't speak for a while. She didn't speak either. The silence was the comfortable kind, which was notable because it had been earned. "Calhoun will lawyer up," he said eventually. "I know. The DA's office contacted Marcus this morning. They want Pruitt's statement and the phone records." He looked at the horizon. "It's going to be a long process." "I know that too. You're going to be part of it. They'll want your statement, what you saw in the building, in the hospital room." She nodded. She'd expected this. It was the checklist reformatting itself around the new information, which was what checklists did. "Your brother," he said. "He's still asleep." "The housing situation." He turned to look at her. In the morning light, he looked older than she'd thought, and also somehow less damaged. Or not less damaged, but differently so. The damage visible as the thing that had shaped rather than the thing that had broken. "There are 32 acres of compound property in this chapter's jurisdiction. We have 3 houses on that property that we use for members in transition." She looked at him. "One of them is empty," he said. "Has been for 4 months. 2 bedrooms. Red door. I don't know why. Whoever painted it last had a preference." He held her gaze. "It's documented residential property. The deed holder is the Iron Angels Charitable Trust, which has been a registered nonprofit for 11 years. That's about as stable and documented as housing gets." She heard what he was offering. She heard all of it. Not just the house, but the structure around it, the legal legitimacy, the specific items on Briggs's checklist that it would satisfy. She heard the thing underneath that too, and she let herself hear it, which was harder. "You don't owe me that," she said. "No," he said. "I don't." He looked back at the morning. "Claire would have been the same age as you, give or take." A pause. "I don't think that's why. I want to be clear that I don't think that's why." "Then why?" He was quiet for a moment. A bird started somewhere in the eucalyptus, and then stopped, and then started again. "Because you went in," he said. "Not because you came out. Not because of what you did inside. Because you went in when you didn't have to, and you did it for a man you'd talked to for 4 minutes over a coffee refill." He turned to look at her again. "That's not something you explain. That's something you recognize. And when you recognize it, you don't walk away from it." She looked at the yard, at the bikes in the copper morning light, at the door of the house behind her, through which, in a back room with an amber lamp, her brother was sleeping on a couch. "Red door," she said. "Red door," he said. She pressed her lips together, held it. Then she said, "Okay." He nodded, once, drank his coffee. Marcus found her an hour later, in the yard, sitting on a bike that wasn't hers. A Sportster, old and well-kept, belonging to someone she didn't know, parked at the end of the row. She wasn't doing anything with it. She was just sitting on it the way you sit somewhere when you need to be somewhere specific and outside at the same time. He sat on the bike next to it. His hands were wrapped. She noticed this, new bandaging on the knuckles, the neat kind that meant Ruth had done it. "How's your arm?" he said. "Same bruise, new contacts," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The closest thing to one she'd seen on him. They sat for a while in the yard with the morning coming in and the damp smell of grass and the sounds of the house behind them. Voices, a door, the clatter of a kitchen operating at scale, someone's bike turning over briefly and then settling. "You know it doesn't go away," he said. "What doesn't?" "The way it felt in that building." He looked at his hands. The way the world felt when you came out. It doesn't go back to what it was. She thought about this. About Rosie's diner and the 22 steps from the kitchen window to the corner table and the 14 months of suspended forward motion, and whether any of that was still there or whether it had been replaced by something she hadn't named yet. "Is that a warning?" she said. "No," he said. "Just a fact." She looked at the horizon. "I can work with facts." He looked at her for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "I think you probably can." The memorial ride happened 3 months later. Not the charity ride. That one had been rescheduled, reorganized, completed in the quiet professional way that the Iron Angels completed things when they put their collective will behind them, which was completely. This was the chapter's annual ride, the one they did every year in October. The one that went from the compound through the valley and up into the hills and back. The one where they rode for the names on the workshop wall, for Claire Mercer and every other name, for the specific dead who had bought with their own expenditure the living's right to keep moving. 347 bikes. She was on a borrowed Softail. Hers, technically, or it was becoming hers. The ownership paperwork in a folder on the kitchen counter of a house with a red door where Danny was currently at school and coming home on a bus that stopped 2 blocks away. In the same school district where she was enrolled in a nursing program that had found, upon review of her application and transcript, that the clinical aptitude scores warranted an expedited readmission. She was third in the formation. Behind Marcus, beside a woman named Danny from the Sacramento chapter, who rode with the particular precision of someone for whom riding was the clearest form of language available. Gideon was at the front. He was on his bike. The leg had healed enough, not completely, not the way it would have healed 20 years ago, not without the permanent specific ache that he now carried along with everything else he carried, one more thing added to the collection. But he was on his bike, and the bike was running, and the road went north out of the compound gate and into the valley morning, and when he rolled through that gate, the sound that rose from 347 bikes was not a cheer, and it was not a ceremony, and it was not a performance. It was just the sound of engines, unanimous and enormous, the sound of a great many people going in the same direction for the same reasons. She went with them. The valley opened up as they climbed, the hills coming down to meet the road, and then falling back as they crested, and the full expanse of the California morning spread out on both sides. Dry grass and dark oak, and the occasional farmhouse, and the sky doing what October skies do in this part of the world, which is be so blue and so clear that it seems less like weather and more like a decision. The wind came off the hills cold and direct, and she leaned into it and felt it in her face, and her eyes watered from the speed and the cold, and she let it happen without correcting it. At the top of the highest point on the route, Gideon stopped. The columns stopped behind him, one by one, engines idling and then cutting, until the hillside was quiet and 347 people were sitting on their bikes in the October morning looking out at the valley below. He got off his bike. He moved to the road's edge, the crutch unnecessary on the flat surface now, the leg bearing weight. It had been told it wouldn't bear this soon by doctors he'd thanked politely and not listened to. He stood with his back to the column and looked out at the valley for a moment, and then he turned. He looked at Maya. She got off the Softail. She walked to the front of the column, past bikes and people she knew now. Not all of them, not by a long stretch, but enough. The specific enough of a world that had been foreign 14 months ago and had since developed geography, landmarks, the particular coordinates of faces she would recognize in any room. Marcus. Danny. Trace. Cole, who had not left the back office at the compound on the night of the standoff, and who had spent 2 weeks being quietly embarrassed about it until she'd told him, in very direct terms, that he'd done exactly what he'd been told to do, and that was what you did, and he'd looked at her like she'd said something he needed to hear. Briggs, her Briggs, the caseworker, had called to congratulate her on the hearing outcome, and she had thanked him with a warmth she genuinely felt, and that had nothing to do with the specific relief of getting what she'd needed from a system that had made her wait. She stopped in front of Gideon. He reached into his cut. He pulled out something small and flat and held it toward her. A patch, she saw, not standard, not the chapter patch, or the member designation she'd learned to read, but something different. The embroidery showed an angel with a broken wing, mid-flight, still ascending. "Friend of angels," he said. "We've given it 11 times in 30 years. He held it out. "You don't have to wear it. It means something specific, and you should know what it means before you put it on. Tell me, she said. It means we see you, he said. It means wherever you go and whatever comes next, you have 347 people who know your name and know your worth and will show up. He looked at her steadily. It means you're not invisible anymore. She took the patch from him. She looked at it in her palm. The broken wing, the upward motion, the thread worn in at the edges of it, which told her it had been held and touched many times before being passed on. She thought about Earl's diner, about the 22 steps, about a gap in the rubble, 16 inches wide, and the arithmetic of being the only person who fit. She thought about what it had cost to go in, about what she had found inside. She closed her hand around the patch. Okay, she said. Gideon nodded. Behind them, someone started an engine, then another, and another, spreading down the column, the hill filling with the accumulated rumble of 347 engines finding their voice, and the sound of it moved through her chest and her bones and the cold October air around her. And it was not like a beginning, and it was not like an ending. It was like a road. It went north into the morning. She walked back to the Softail. She swung her leg over. She settled her weight into the seat, and she followed it. The valley fell away behind them. The sky held its October blue. Danny was in school 2 hours south, in a classroom doing something with construction paper, and a teacher who had noted in a recent call that he was doing well, that he'd started drawing different things. Not just the house, other things. Streets, people, a motorcycle that she suspected was based on the one currently under her. The formation crested the last hill and began the long descent back toward the compound, and the wind came up to meet them, and the chrome in the sunlight was the specific chrome of things that had been through the dark and carried it and kept going. She kept going. The road ran long and straight into the valley below, and the engines ran behind her and ahead of her and all around her, and the morning that had started cold and specific and wide was still all of those things. And she was in the middle of it, going forward, and for the first time in a very long time, there was nothing suspended about it. She was there. She was present. She was moving. She was home.